Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brad Sears, Executive Director of the Williams Institute, and I'm so excited you can join us here today for what's going to be a great panel looking at some research that we just have finished doing from a survey this summer. The title of our discussion today is LGBTQ Discrimination in 2021, the role of race, religion, the closet, and covering. And I could not handpick a better group of people to have this discussion with, because I did handpick this group of people to have the discussion with. So I'm going to introduce them each briefly, and then we're going to jump right into the conversation. The panel will go until 2:15 if you're on the West Coast, 5:15 if you're on the East Coast. We're going to actively use the chat. We're going to put some of the data points from our new study into the chat, as well as some of the stories we were told from our almost 1,000 respondents to the survey about what they're experiencing in terms of discrimination and harassment. And just a warning, some of those stories are very vivid and really speak to the very explicit and aggressive harassment that many people in our community continue to face. So I encourage you to open up the chat and find out information about the study there as well. I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers and say just a tiny bit about them. I'll start with the Reverend Delman Coates, who's senior pastor of Mount Ennon Baptist Church. This is really one of our community's kind of greatest allies. He came out early in the game on marriage equality and made a huge difference in Maryland. And I remember seeing him in the White House, one of the few people that President Obama brought out with him on stage, announcing the historic executive orders protecting LGBT people in the civil service and federal contractors from discrimination. So thank you for being with us, Reverend Coates. I'm going to jump now to Imani Rupert-Gordon, who is the Executive Director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. It's been great working with Imani recently and seeing not only her leadership at the organizational level, but through a collaboration of all national LGBT groups, showing the great strength and leadership she's providing for the entire movement. One of, I think, the most brilliant minds and strategists of the LGBTQ movement, and my travel buddy to Havana, Nadine Smith, is our next speaker, the Executive Director of Equality Florida. So thank you for being with us, Nadine. And then next, Maria Taylorson, who's the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of TransLatin Coalition, a fantastic organization that she started with our dear friend Bambi Salcedo. Maria has really created a home and is truly saving lives at the work that she and others are doing with the TransLatin Coalition. And last but not least, Congressman Ritchie Torres, someone who's known for the first that he's created in Congress, but I think he will soon become to know for the lasting impact that he's made both on that institution and on people and on government. So thank you for being with us, Congressman. With that, we're going to jump right into looking at some of the results of the study and start discussing kind of what the findings mean, both in thinking about people's lives in the workplace, as well as in terms of policy. And so Anthony, if you want to put up kind of some of the overall findings of the report, I think what we found not so surprising, although the survey was conducted in May of 2021, is the high levels of discrimination and harassment that LGBTQ workers face over the course of their careers. So this slide really asks people to look back over their entire work history and ask them if they experience any discrimination, such as being not hired for a job or fired, or any form of harassment, verbal, physical, sexual. And you can see high reports, lifetime reports of each. Over 4 out of 10 LGBTQ workers had at least one of these experiences in their career. Like I said, this is fairly consistent with other research. What was more surprising is when we asked people to just focus on a subset of these experiences in the past year, and that was the experience of being fired or not hired for a job in the last year. And if you think about to a year ago, what was going on, the Supreme Court had issued its landmark decision in Bostock, and we were in the middle of a pandemic. So during a time when you would have thought people were kind of rallying around each other in the workplace, being more supportive, instead that we find that 1 out of 10 LGBTQ workers report being fired or not hired because of their LGBTQ status in the past year. The situation is actually worse than that, because when we asked people if they were out in the workplace, over half said they're not out to their current supervisor. About a quarter said they're not out to anyone in the workplace. When we just consider the workers who are out in the workplace, that rate of discrimination goes up. For those who are in the closet to everyone, only about 2% of them experience discrimination in the past year. So many employees are still protecting themselves by not being out in the workplace. So Congressman Torres, I really want to take this first question to you. What do we make of this? During a pandemic, kind of post-Bostock, why is this discrimination so persistent? And I know Congress is considering the Equality Act. How can the Equality Act help?
Well, first, it's an honor to be here. I find it striking that in the past year since the Bostock decision, about 10% of LGBTQ employees have seen employment discrimination, which to me is a reminder that passing a law is not mission accomplished. A law is only as good as its enforcement, and it takes time for a law to be fully enforced. It takes time for a law to fundamentally change the reality on the ground, to fundamentally change the lived experience of workplace discrimination. You know, a change in lived experience not only requires a change in law, it requires a change in culture, which happens over time. There's no simple answer to your question, but a few thoughts. I think one, you know, those who are hit the hardest by discrimination, you know, transgendered Americans or LGBTQ Americans of color, those with the lowest incomes, you know, often lack the information and resources necessary for vindicating their rights in court. You know, litigation can be a long, drawn out, expensive, intensive process. So that's one factor at work. I think a second factor at work is discrimination is hard to prove, and it's particularly complicated in the LGBTQ context. You know, if you're Black, you cannot, for the most part, you cannot conceal or cover your racial identity, right? There's no escaping it, there's no hiding it. Whereas if you're LGBTQ, you might be able to conceal and cover your sexual identity, and the repressive atmosphere that forces you into the closet or forces you into covering behaviors or forces you out of the workplace, that's a discrimination of its own, but it's hard to prove in a court of law because it's so subjective, it's so experiential. I think part of it is, you know, the numbers might be a lagging indicator. You know, I'm hopeful that Gen Z and millennials are the most pro-LGBTQ generations in history. And as Gen Zers and millennials assume greater positions of power in the workplace, the reality on the ground will fundamentally improve.
Yeah, I'm hopeful for that as well. Did anybody else have any kind of thoughts about the general findings as kind of persistent discrimination that occurred even during the pandemic?
Well, I actually think that the pandemic arrives at a time of incredible division, of the sort of aftermath, not just of the Trump years, but the groundwork that led to the Trump years of vilification and dehumanization. And so, you know, so it's not surprising to me, and we're still seeing that. The hate crime stats that just came out showed an increase in hate crimes, you know, across the board, targeting all different populations, and including the LGBT community. So if we see more violence, and that we would see more discrimination in our places of employment, more harassment. And so that is not surprising. And I will just say this: I think it's always both legal work and cultural work, meaning that when you achieve a law, you begin to say, as a society, this is our bare minimum. This is what we expect of everybody. And if you don't adhere to this, then you are outside. You're the outsider. You're the person who's behaving in ways that are unwelcome. And so we can see culture shift because of that. And we saw it in the military, where when all of the commanders said, this is the way it is, friends who were in the military said it was like night and day. but that shift goes in both directions, unfortunately. And so we've spent some years under an administration with legislators openly hostile and empowered to be. And so, yeah, so the numbers are unfortunately rising.
Thanks, Nadine. And I think, like, as I've shared these results with some people, and Nadine, you're there in Florida, and so I think if you're in LA, if you're in New York, some of these numbers might be surprising. These are people from all across the country, and as we'll get into it later, like if you're working for a Sonic, if you're working for a Home Depot, if you're working in a warehouse, your experience is also going to be very different. And unless someone else has anything they want to jump in here, I'm gonna turn, I think, to Nadine a little bit more. And Anthony, if you can show us kind of the differences in discrimination based on race. And again, this is something that was not surprising. This is kind of similar to things that we've seen from past reports. The breakdown here is those orange bars represent LGBT people of color. And we had a really great racially diverse sample. The blue bars are white LGBT people, and you'll see clear across LGBT people of color reporting more discrimination, more harassment than white LGBT people. I wanted you to focus in on two particular statistics, which are similar for people of color who are LGBT and trans people in general, which is not being hired. So it's not about being outed or getting fired once you're on your job. You can't even get through the door. You can't get through the application process. And so that's a statistically significant difference, that 29% of people of color reporting that who are LGBT versus 18.3. And then the verbal harassment. And Congressman Torres talked about the kind of visibility that comes along with race and ethnicity. Perhaps that's part of the reason why another statistically significant difference here is that over a third of LGBT people of color report being verbally harassed because of their LGBT status in the workplace, and that's a quarter for white LGBT people. Nadine, I'd love to just get your kind of thoughts on this, on why the discrimination is more for people of color, and then I think a great thing that President Biden did on day one in his executive order implementing the Bostock decision, he specifically called out intersectional discrimination and said it is a policy across this federal government to address intersectional discrimination, not just divided up on race and gender and sexual orientation, but really realize how those things work together. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of that and continuing that with the Equality Act.
Well, absolutely. In fact, I think one of the things that has really come to the forefront in recent years is, the lifting up of voices in the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in a way where popular culture sort of defines gayness as white and somewhat affluent, not reflecting the reality of who we are. So in a world where racial discrimination in employment continues to exist, it's not, again, surprising to find that LGBTQ people of color, Black and Indigenous folks are also experiencing discrimination at a higher level white counterpart. When we think of the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and Ahmaud Arbery and on all of the street organizing that came in the aftermath, it also lifted up the voices of Black LGBTQ people at the center of those struggles, responding from that experience, but also as organizers. And so, to me, this moment that we are in is about not just saying that Black Lives Matter, but all Black Lives Matter. And that includes seeing our traditional leadership apparatus in the Black community, for example, showing up when Black trans women are murdered. And it means that the infrastructure of the LGBTQ community has to incorporate actively the things that disproportionately are impacting the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and the most, the folks who are bearing the brunt. And right now that means trans people, it means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It means young people who are being targeted, particularly right now in our schools. Understanding, monolith that we are indeed everywhere. We occupy every demographic, every geographic space on Earth means that our the things that we prioritize have to reflect that.
Yeah. And Rachel continues. So Rachel's our communications person. She's putting stories in from the survey. So I appreciate your sympathy for Rachel, but she didn't experience all those things. She's just putting quotes in from the story of very horrific things happening to a lot of the respondents who were asked to describe their worst experience of discrimination or harassment. Any other folks want to jump in here and how do we approach, how do we address intersectional discrimination?
I'm happy to hop in.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be important that when we talk about intersectionality, that we're on the same page and we know what we're talking about. So often when we say intersectionality, we talk about what it's like to have an underrepresented identity and how difficult that is. But that's not actually what intersectionality is. It's talking very specifically about the systems that exist and how someone with multiple underrepresented identities might get trapped, or those systems won't work for this person because when the systems were created, they weren't looking at trying to support the most underrepresented folks. And so when we think about what intersectionality is, to keep that in mind, that we're not actually talking about people, we're talking about the systems that are breaking down so that folks aren't able to succeed in those systems, and our solutions have to do that as well. And I think that that's something that's really important. One of the things I appreciate that we're looking at this statistic right now. It's a very different reality when we look at people, when we look at someone and we add on layers of marginalization, because when you add on layers, it gets worse. And that's how we're able to see that low incomes, that neighborhoods can translate to health outcomes, which actually really shouldn't make any sense there, but it does because of these intersectional problems that we have. And so I was just going to add that.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we're going to come back to that because I think those systems combine to create types of discrimination and harassment deployed at different parts of the LGBT community. So people aren't experiencing the same forms of discrimination, and the systems kind of work together to create these kind of different channels of hate. Yeah, Maria.
Yes, I will also like to add that you have to, when you're thinking of people of color, you also have to think of recent immigrants and people who are that speak one language, and how they navigate a system that for the last 4 years has been dismissive to them in every facet of our society, and how that is embedded in how people hire and look at specific communities. That's something to really take into account also.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that struck me is that, if your employer requires name tags, that's a site of discrimination. If you're like many people are in a jobs where somebody gets to set your schedule every week or every couple of weeks, that is a great deal of power in a site of another form of discrimination and harassment. So I was telling someone earlier today, if I had to do this survey over, I would have a whole new set of questions to really ask people about the types of discrimination and harassment they're facing. Maria, we're gonna come to you next, and Anthony, if you want to put up the next slide. So another kind of part of the LGBTQ community that experiences more discrimination and harassment are trans people. And here the label is transgender, the people who identified as gender non-binary or trans or something other than male or female were put into this category. And you can again see, just like LGBTQ people of color, on every single bar here, from fired and not being hired to physical, sexual, and verbal harassment, trans people are experiencing a higher level. About 2/3 of trans people reporting these experiences over a lifetime versus 43% of LGBT people. And again, the things that really stuck out as statistically significant, so they kind of show up in our models as being particularly persistent for trans people, is not being hired, so not even getting in the door to get the job, and then verbal harassment. So we've talked about these forms of discrimination. I want to add in another layer, and then Maria asked you a question. So Anthony, could you put up the next slide that looks at various forms of covering? So covering is basically ways that people, marginalized communities, downplay identity and difference to kind of get along, and in the workplace to get along with whatever workplace or professional culture is there. So as a gay man, I might change my voice when I enter to a meeting or when I'm teaching. A woman of color may not wear braids, either be told not to wear braids or not wear braids to fit in the culture. But it's a dampening down of difference to kind of get by in a workplace culture. And obviously means you're not bringing your full self to work, right? You're making some changes to get along in whatever environment you're in. LGBT people reported very high levels of being in the closet, as I mentioned earlier. So they're just not out. That's probably one of the largest forms, the kind of most drastic forms of covering, is you just don't come out. But even if they're out, I call this kind of just being LGBT in name only. You kind of, I'm out, but then I'm going to try to fit into every expected type of behavior in the workplace that's out there. And you can see again that trans people have higher rates of covering across these different dimensions, changing your physical appearance or dress, changing how often you go to the bathroom, where you go to the bathroom, changing your voice or mannerisms. So you go into the workplace and present something different than who you are in order to get along. And a third of trans people are reporting doing that. Maria, I want to ask you again, just kind of your thoughts about the higher levels of discrimination against trans people, kind of in general, and then what it means for workers to actually have to engage in those kind of self-dampening behaviors to get along at work. You need to turn, if you can turn your volume on, that'd be great.
I'm sorry, I was muted.
All right.
In essence, in a nutshell, for trans people, it continues to mean that we live below poverty levels across this country. The truth is that discrimination against trans people is pervasive across the board in all different sectors, especially including housing and employment. Even if somebody has a degree or has formal education, the getting in the door to the job is the biggest obstacle. As a trans person myself, I'm fortunate that I work in a place that has been created for me, right? This is a trans-led organization that was created to specifically address the needs of trans people. But would I be able to have the same position that I have currently within my organization anywhere else? Would I be hired with the years of expertise that I've developed and the education that I've gathered in another organization, even within the LGBT nonprofit sector? Possibly not, because the challenge is that being trans continues to be a big obstacle. Something that I said that for me, the minute I transitioned, there was so many doors that closed down for me, opportunities. And I can speak for myself. I can't, and this is also my perception, I can't leave my transness at home. I'm one of those people that is perceived to be trans. And I know many people would tell me, oh, Maria, I think, I would have never known you were trans. But those are not my experiences when I walk down the street and people use the derogatory language or abusive behavior towards everything I represent. And although there's a notion in society that things are getting better because we're seeing trans people on TV and we're getting Emmys and awards, on the ground, trans people are having challenges just getting entry-level, minimum wage field positions, even within education. So it is important to understand that there has to be more programming that both supports people get better education and also holds these establishment accountable, because it is very difficult for us to be able to show that we've been discriminated against. Once, as it was mentioned before, having legal representation, having the basic knowledge of your rights, and how it varies across all the different states. So something that might apply for me here in California would not be the same for a trans person that lives in Louisiana. We continue to see discrimination that is pervasive, policies that are discriminatory that are being implemented. So it's a state of emergency that has been existing since I've came out as trans, that continues to be pervasive today. The goal for me and for many trans people is to create places that are safe for trans people to come, get access to resources that will support them navigate the world, because the truth is that most trans people are in fight and flight mode every day we leave our doors. And it's my experience as an executive here, one of the largest nonprofits that focuses, I walk down the street and I'm just a trans person to the average person. And everything I represent for many people is, it emotes such hate. So it's challenging today still.
Yeah, and and Imani was talking about kind of, we may need to think of different solutions as we think of these systems that exclude people. And so do you want to share some of the work that you're doing at TransLatino Coalition? If a non-discrimination law isn't going to get people through the application process and getting into a job, what are some of the types of support and programs that you're offering?
We feel that, because traditionally most of the services provided for trans people are around the HIV world, right? Most programming. And we feel that everything that we address is going to have better health outcomes for trans people. So our organization provides some of the basic sort of critical things that we need, which is food, access to food, shelter, support with writing a resume, doing workshops, providing legal representation, some of those core things that people need in order to be able to navigate a world that is really difficult. And I think that there could be policies that are in place both at a state, local level, but the implementation of those policies and how those really translate to people on the ground are very different. So we want to make sure that we're there advocating not only for their needs, but that they're educated about what the next steps are for them to be able to address. We do have programs that focus also on supporting people who have been victims of violence, because we continue to see the numbers of violence increase, not only nationally and locally, but across the world. So as a trans person, I feel that it's imperative that we have funding across the nation to support programs like this that move away from just the traditional HIV prevention programming that we've had.
Excellent, excellent. And I think when we look, the Equality Act is an important next step, but there's a lot of decisions made in the federal budget about vocational training, about mentorship programs, and making sure that LGBT people, and particularly trans people, are fully included in the funding streams and eligible for those programs is another important piece.
And that we also have access, right? Because I think a lot of the times these systems that you have to apply for funding are so complex that trans-led organizations that are startup don't have the capacity to be able to apply for these funds. So we need also support for those organizations that are beginning to establish their infrastructure.
Excellent. I think I'm gonna turn next. I'm gonna come back to you, Imani, and talk about one of those specific forms of discrimination that I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to or to think enough about. And so often when we talk about harassment in the workplace for LGBTQ people, I think people focus on verbal harassment. And this is actually a measure of verbal harassment directed specifically at the respondent. So they were, and I'm sure Rachel's going to share some horrific stories about the things being said to workers in the workplace. The number for people reporting that they hear slurs, derogatory jokes, comments in the workplace about LGBTQ people, whether directed at them or just as part of the workplace environment, more than double. So that's over 60%, almost 2/3 of people reporting they hear that sort of thing. I know from the research that I've been doing that these next two forms are also a common part of people's experience, that the harassment is not just verbal, it's physical. And in the stories that people report in our survey are about being attacked, punched, slapped on the job, and even more stories, about 1 in 4 people reporting sexual harassment on the job. Which can go from sexual harassment that is verbal, clear in some of the stories that were told, to sexual assault and rape. I want to focus in on one part, the biggest part of the LGBT community, which is bisexual women. And so there are more women in the LGBT community than men, and the majority of those women identifies bisexual. So if you made a pie of this community, the biggest slice is bisexual women. And what struck me in reading through several hundred really horrific stories that people were telling about their experiences is that to come out in the workplace as bisexual is basically to invite attention and harassment on the assumption that you just came out as promiscuous, open to 3 ways, open to having sex with multiple people, that there was such a consistency in the language being used against these women, and it was so pervasive. So I just wanted to get your thoughts about the findings, and then as a movement, where sexual harassment is a type of harassment being focused in our community. Are we doing enough to respond to that?
Gotcha. Thanks so much. So this is such an important question. And the fact that bisexual women are the largest part of the LGBTQ community, but so often left out, it means that we're missing the mark. But the question, really is why we're missing the mark. And when I think about the ways that we need to do better, I think about it in 2 different ways. One, I think in our data collection and in inclusion generally. So the first is with data. We know that nothing happens to support underrepresented folks without data. That's just not something that happens. What history has shown us is for the most privileged communities that we can use something like a common sense logic or something you know it when you see it. But for the most underrepresented, we have to prove it. And we see this in things like voting suppression, wage gap discrepancies, unfair drug policies, these types of things. But in this country, data informs policy and policy informs funding. So anytime there's an effort to restrict any sort of data collection, we know that this is a blatant and very effective way to silence and erase our communities. Because without data, we're not going to have the policies to support our communities, and we're not going to have the funding to change anything. And so then even our internal policies are going to be based on individual experiences. So they won't do much to combat like systemic oppression. And so we know that nothing affects our communities the same way. So the lack of data makes it impossible for us to protect our communities. And that's especially true of the people that are the most underrepresented. But this has to be done in a real way. And this is bringing this back. When we say LGBTQ, are we effectively including bisexual folks? Are we effectively including trans folks? I would say that we aren't. Our words, we have to say what we mean, and we have to be explicit about who we're leaving out, because so often when we say LGBTQ people, we're expecting this, but the data is showing us that there are very real and very specific ways that bisexual people are left out of our movement, and we're not effectively looking at that. And that brings me to the second thing, and that is that we have to think about inclusion. And I think that, and I want to think about that in 2 different ways. The first is that representation matters. We have to have people from all different identities in positions of leadership, but throughout organizations. But we need to do a better job of including people. But our laws and our policies also have to be inclusive. And one of the things I want to mention, because we're having this discussion, is that we're talking about the Bostock decision, which is life-changing. It includes all of us. But it didn't have to. And when we look at the Bostock decision and all of the cases that we are looking at, None of these cases, we're talking very specifically about sexual orientation of folks with same-sex or same-gender partners and trans folks, and didn't specifically talk about someone that is bisexual. Now, let's not sound the alarm. This very much, Bostock very much includes and supports bisexual people. Like, that's nonsense that people put out there, and that's not what I'm saying. But what I do want to say is that there are bad courts out there, and they are going to try it. And so we have to make sure that when we are doing this work to protect our communities, that we have to make sure that we're protecting all of our communities, because there have been courts that have tried to go and say, maybe this doesn't include bisexual people because we haven't said it in particular. And so looking at the very particular needs of any community and making sure that we're including it. And the fact that we're talking about the largest part of the LGBTQ community, and there are so many ways that this part of our community is left out, it means that we're doing a horrible job. And so we have to make sure that, I was talking about this earlier, when we look at intersections of identity, bisexual women are facing erasure, but also heterosexism, but also sexism. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about intersectionality. Bisexual women are falling through the cracks. And that's because, like I said before, our systems aren't built to support and look at all of those levels of oppression. And so to fix this, we need to say LGBTQ people and legitimately include bisexual people and folks that have been left out. And we have to acknowledge the very specific needs of these communities. And that means that we have to learn more, because honestly, it is pretty ridiculous that, it wasn't mentioned at all in Bostock, that this is even something that we have to do. But that is showing us this is something that we are consistently overlooking in our movement. And so we want to make sure that we're doing this so that bisexual women and everyone in the LGBTQ community, that no one is falling through the cracks.
Yeah, definitely.
So Brad, could I ask Imani a question? I don't want to violate protocol.
Oh yeah, jump in. Yeah.
Thank you, Imani, for that. This comment causes me to ask, can you see the methodology of the study and the research being done differently to sort of tease out this data in a way that would address this? I'm thankful for your comment, because I really thought that the research study I was going to commend the Williams Institute and the team for giving us this data, because oftentimes when we lack the data, or when we have the data, it helps us to make our case and to advance our cause. But your comment causes me to wonder, whether there's something about the methodology that you would suggest or recommend to help kind of tease out this particular data point.
Sure. Like I said this sort of joking before. Honestly, the Williams Institute really got me through grad school. This was the only way that I could look at LGBTQ folks and look at the research that was specifically looking at us. And so, I don't have a criticism about this particular data. What I'm saying is that we need data for our community so that we can say larger things. One of the things I do really like about what's happened here is pulling out the difference between talking about sexual orientation and talking about the differences between individuals in the LGBTQ community. The fact that we're able to say that bisexual people and transgender people have a very different experience from other folks in the LGBTQ community, I think is huge, because so often we're in a situation where we say, oh, this affects the LGBTQ community. And when you drill down and you look at different parts of the LGBTQ community, before this, I ran an organization serving, highlighting the experiences of Black LGBTQ women. And the research that we have very much wasn't looking specifically at the needs of Black LGBTQ women. It was the larger LGBTQ community. So we couldn't talk about the very specific needs of one part of that community. And I think having this conversation is a really important one, because we're able to take these things out, but then also when we're talking about intersectional perspectives of looking at how we look at these different parts of the community, but also how do we look at other layers of oppression? How do we look at race? How do we look at economic equality? How do we look at gender as well? And looking at all of these things, because, we don't get anywhere without this data. So often we talk about the wage gap, and it's women make about 20% less than men, and that's been for a good long while. But we know that is far different for women of color. That Latino women make about 54% of what white men make. But what we don't often see is that people with disabilities make 37% less than people without disabilities. That trans people, the research isn't even collected the same way, so we can't even talk about trans people the same way we would here. But we can talk and say that at least 33% of trans people are experiencing wait, let me get this right, are living at or under the poverty line. And so we want to make sure that all of these things are things that we can look at, and making sure that we have the opportunity to look at a community and then to look at other levels. It's going to be how we get to equality. So I don't have criticism about the way that this was done. I'm actually very thankful that it is done, because there are so few ways that we get information about this community and that we can tease it out a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and understand, like I said earlier, there's different things I do about this survey right now. And I hope as we learn about different groups within that are in the LGBT community, we continue to refine and kind of ask questions specific to those different experiences. I mean, a couple of things you said jump out to me is, first, if anyone questions why sexual orientation and gender identity under the Equality Act is linked to sex discrimination, or in Bostock is linked to sex discrimination, I think you can look at this data, you can look at the sexual harassment data, you can look at the stories Rachel's been putting in the chat. The people who are discriminating are not making these distinctions. They are all in. Anything they think and see about you, they are throwing in there. And we really made the case, and I have to say, first internally to other LGBTQ organizations, for the need to require intersectional discrimination explicitly. And then actually it was seemed to be a bit less of a lift with the Biden administration, because if you don't do that, you really haven't addressed the experiences that people are having. If you're going to allow a theory that would allow a court just to look at the discrimination based on sexual orientation or just on gender identity, and not take into account the sexist or racist things that are being said at the same time, you really haven't protected people. And so when we got asked, why this executive order, why the LGBT executive order, our response was, because you really haven't addressed the types of discrimination the research shows, unless you're going to allow people to bring in all the facts about what happened to them. I'm going to turn to you, Reverend Coates, next. And Anthony, if you want to pull up the next slide. I think this again was something that was more surprising to me. And for context for this slide, I should say, we asked people, do you think the discrimination or harassment against you was religiously motivated? And 57% of the respondents said yes. So over half the people said yes. And then we said, well, are you just inferring that? Why do you believe that discrimination or harassment was religiously motivated? And the answer was pretty resoundingly, because the people discriminating and harassing it are saying that it's religiously motivated. It wasn't a big inference. And so many times in the news, there was just a successful case out here where somebody who teaches at a religious school has won their case under the Civil Rights Act. And you kind of hear these kind of sanitized stories where someone's teaching a religious school, or someone is quietly objecting but doesn't want to provide services to a lesbian couple. And those are the examples we hear about religious discrimination. I think what came through in this survey is that that is happening. And then this harassment in the workplace, where people are being told they're going to go to hell, they're being told they're sinners, that they're abomination, they're getting literature left off at their desk. We had about 187 stories from the just under 1,000 respondents of that nature. And again, there is a difference here for people of color who are LGBT and white LGBT people, with a much higher percentage, about 2/3 of the LGBT people of color reporting that the discrimination was religiously motivated, and just under half of the white LGBT people. So Reverend Coates, I know you've done such fantastic work working with communities of faith, working with them I think not only to support, but really changing minds about LGBT rights and people. I'd love to get your reactions to these findings, and then what more can be done? What more can be done to, I guess, for me, some of this is coming from the pulpit, and some of this might be a disconnect between what's coming from the pulpit and what people are doing on the ground. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, there's so much I could say. The irony of me sitting on this panel today is, as soon as this panel is over, I head to my church to record my sermon for next Sunday, which is actually on biblical malpractice. That's what I'm actually preaching on, biblical malpractice. And we know throughout the history of the country that the Bible has been used to justify and to provide a rationale, religious rationale for all sorts of discrimination. We all know the history on that. And I'm deeply disturbed by the way in which the rhetoric of God and faith in the Bible gets drawn in to justify how we treat LGBTQ plus Americans. Now, I want to say this first. As a person of faith, I believe in the separation of church and state. It's an article of faith for me. So while I may spend some time exploring the theological framework that enables me to enthusiastically and unapologetically support the LGBT community, I don't believe my view of the Bible or your view of the Bible should be the basis for whether we extend equal treatment under the law to every person. I don't want a liberal theocracy any more than I want a conservative one. And I say that as a faith leader and as a faith leader who serves, a 10,000 member church. That what makes our country so great is that people have freedom of and from religion. And so I think it's important for people to kind of understand that what makes America so great is that regardless of my interpretation of Genesis 19 or Jerry Falwell Jr.'s, that my neighbors, my family members deserve to be treated equally and fairly under the law. That said, it's been important for me over the last 10 years to help people of faith understand that my enthusiastic and unapologetic advocacy for the LGBT community is not despite the Bible, but because of it. I don't support LGBTQ rights because I suspend the Bible. Like, oh, well, we know the Bible prohibits and condemns homosexuality, and so I'm just going to suspend the Bible over here and just, and I'm going to, treat everyone equally. I don't suspend the Bible. I support our LGBTQ plus sisters and brothers because of it. And what I mean by that is I try to help people to understand, as a pastor and as a faith leader, that there are no biblical condemnations against same-gender loving people or consensual same-gender loving sex. There's not one passage of the Bible. I say that as a Bible scholar. All of these texts, the sort of 6 or 7 texts that are often used to condemn LGBTQ folks are condemnations of acts of sexual violence, rape, abuse. These are not condemnations of consensual same-gender loving people or consensual same-gender loving sex acts. And I walk people through an understanding of these texts because oftentimes people are relying on very colloquial English translations that are produced by committees of people who don't read the Bible in their original languages, in Greek or Hebrew, who don't understand the philological and linguistic and cultural context of these passages of scripture. And so they take them out of context, and then they become a pretext for discrimination and bias. And so I try to help people to understand that these are not texts of consensual sex. None of these texts, the Leviticus, Genesis, Sodom and Gomorrah, all of this stuff These are actually texts about protecting the other. I'm preaching on the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And this is not a text condemning consensual, same gender loving people. This is actually a text that admonishes us to protect the most vulnerable among us. And so that said, I think that then provides a window for inviting people to reassess their theological and biblical claims and assumptions. And I find this whole notion, Brad, about, I'm just sort of standing up for my faith and standing up for my Bible really deeply hypocritical, because those same people are not for denying rights to people who are gluttons or people who commit adultery, which they believe the Bible condones, or they're not for denying equal rights to people who divorce. I was with a group of pastors and they were anti, LGBTQ rights. And I say, well, why don't we deny rights to those who've been divorced? Well, they got quiet because 2/3 of them have been divorced. So I tell them, you are not standing up for your beliefs if you're not consistent with it. You're then standing up for your biases and your bigotry. And let's leave God out of that. This is all about your own biases. And so we've got a lot of work to do to educate the public about their faith claims, both in terms of understanding the importance of having a non-theistic democracy, pluralistic democracy, and at the same time providing people with a broader framework for understanding their faith claims so that they can love, embrace, warm, welcome, and affirm their LGBTQIA plus family members and neighbors without feeling like they have to suspend their faith or suspend the Bible. They can do so because of it.
Right. That's great. That's great. You're getting a lot of praise in the chat. There's one thing I just want to call out, because they say you're one of the few Black Christian ministers, and I know you work with a large coalition of ministers. Do you want to talk about that? Because you are unique and special, but you also there are many more out there. I wonder if you want to talk for a few minutes about how you work in coalition.
Well, yes. So I am the chair and founder of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality. It is a public policy advocacy group for progressive Black churches and faith leaders. Are theblackchurch.org, commercial for our little organization's website. Anyway, but we were successful in Maryland in passing marriage equality back in 2012 because we changed the narrative on where Black faith leaders were on this question. And what I found, Brad, and to the rest of the panel, is that Black clergy can be oftentimes like the stock market, a lagging indicator. Fact of the matter is, the people in the pews get it. We have got to stop defining the Black church by the handful of Black males who stand behind a podium every week and preach. The Black church is a constellation of people in the pews, people who don't just sit on the front row, but those who sit in the balconies and the margins. And I have found that the Black church is a reference to that subset of African sacred spirituality that has been on the side of the fight for freedom, justice, and equality. And that when you provide people with space and an opportunity to express their thoughts without this guy standing over their head, feeling as if, if they said something different, they would be condemned. People, 2012 was the best year in the history of our church. We had over 1,000 people join our church in that year alone when I came out in support of LGBTQ rights. And it's because people don't want to be on the side of codifying discrimination as a part of the law. And I believe that Black people accept the notion of the extended family, right? Now, Black folks go to family reunions pre-COVID every summer. And at that family reunion, you're going to have all kinds of family members there. You're going to have one table with the aunties, talking about who made the potato salad and where we're going to church on Sunday. On the fringes, you're going to have cousins and uncles, with some bottles and brown bags, talking about what clubs they're going to go to that night. But yet, with all of that difference and diversity, we are all in the same family. And so Black people, we are not going to allow extremists, the right, people who seek to divide, to win the day. I believe that the majority of the Black, you can't talk about the civil rights movement you can't talk about gospel music without talking about the contributions past and present of our LGBTQ sisters and brothers. And so I believe we need to change this narrative and trouble this narrative about where Black people of faith and Black Christians are on these types of issues. If, as Congressman Torres said, this is going to be the most pro-LGBTQ plus generation ever.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll just say this because I think this might have been the last panel I was on with you, was we got a marriage equality decision and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act literally in the same week by the Supreme Court. And so it was with the group of Black progressive ministers, and we did a panel that week about the cases, and it was a rough panel. And so I'll say this: there's a lot of chatter in the chat, but if you want progressive people of faith to show up for LGBTQ rights, or people who are not LGBTQ in the Black community to show up for LGBTQ rights, then we also have to show up for them. And so that was the day when different parts of the community were having very different experiences, and there was a lot to point to from Reverend Coates and from others about people showing up for marriage equality. Unfortunately, at that moment in time, not so much to point to for the LGBT community showing up for voting rights. So this is if we're all at the picnic, if they're all at the barbecue, we all have to show up and do work with each other and for the people who are in all our communities. I'm going to turn now to answering some of the questions. I'm going to bring them in. There's been a couple of questions dealing with kind of it's after Labor Day. People are being asked to come back into the office. What does all this mean for LGBTQ people in terms of what remote work meant during for discrimination and being in the closet and covering, and how can employers make the workplace a place that's more attractive as people come back? And Imani and Nadine, I wonder if I could start with you, just your consideration, your kind of thoughts about this kind of return to work in light of some of the research we've seen.
I'm happy.
Imani, yeah, go ahead.
Sure, I've just spoken out. I just wanted to give you some space, Nadine. So, I mean, a few things. So, as leaders, it's our responsibility to recruit and cultivate, but also to retain the best employees. And there's no way we can do that if we are consistently promoting policies that disenfranchise the most underrepresented folks in our organizations. And so there's a lot of ways we need to think about that, but we're in a pandemic right now. And one of the ways that we need to think about that is that folks, I know at our organization, like, folks are not comfortable coming back yet, like this is we're in a pandemic, y'all, and no one knows what, the Delta variant is real. And, especially we're thinking about folks with young kids that aren't able to get vaccinated. And that's assuming that everyone, is willing to get vaccinated. But that this is something that's, affecting people in very different ways. I talked about data earlier and why that's so, why data is so important. And, in the beginning of the pandemic, NTLR was pushing to make sure that we are collecting data on sexual orientation. We know that nothing affects our communities the same way. And so, if an organization that has a number of LGBTQ staff members, I do want to make sure that when we open the office back, I do really want to be thoughtful. And I always said, we won't be of the first people to go back. And that is a great deal of privilege that we're able to do work from our homes, and we're still able to make the impact that we're able to do. But also just that it's rough. It's really difficult out there. But, I wanted to say too that, even outside of that, because we get this question a lot, and if we are honest, when we think about our organizations and the people that are working here, the people that had to endure racism and transphobia and ableism and all these other sorts of oppression, and they've made it to our organizations and they're able to do well, those are the people that we actually should be investing in. Those are folks that it's harder for someone to make it here, and that they're able to make it here. Those are the folks we should be investing in and making sure that they're able to succeed. On top of that, there's so much research that shows us that diverse teams are the most creative and they're the most productive. And because we're, as leaders, we're failing if we're not leveling the playing field so that everyone can do the best that they can. That is something that we're able to do. Everyone has their little bit of magic, and we just have to, as leaders, we just have to make it possible for someone's magic to be able to come out. And so I think that's our responsibility, because that benefits all of us. And it also matters because there are very real consequences in our fight for racial justice and gender justice and economic equality. And so when someone leaves their job because they're fired or because they're forced to leave because of their sexual orientation, because of intersections of identity, it makes it really easy for the next person with that identity to suffer that same fate. And so it means that these jobs and these institutions, they're not safe for underrepresented people. And these fields and arenas aren't set up for some of us to participate in. And then we have a situation where folks actually legitimately feel, and it's actually happening in real life, that there are places that we can't be successful in. And that's how leaders contribute to that and make that harder for folks. And so we have to find ways that to make this, to level the playing field so that everyone's able to participate. And so there are real and pragmatic reasons to invest in LGBTQ people at your organization. Like, there are very pragmatic reasons, and those are some of them, but also it's just the right thing to do, and it's illegal not to. So also do that, because I think that's important. We get this question a lot, and there are very legitimate reasons to do it, but it's also just the right thing to do. And when we aren't doing it, it's not just that we are keeping things the same, we are legitimately making things worse. And we need to acknowledge that when we're not making them better, it's not leaving them the same, we're making them worse. And so we have to do that. So we can do different things. We don't have to ask people for salary histories. That disproportionately impacts the most underrepresented folks. It hurts the same people over and over again. We can consider having a scale so that no one has to negotiate a salary. So we know what we can pay you. When you're hiring someone, you know what you can pay them. Pay them that. And if they shouldn't get paid that, then they're probably not the person for that job, and hire someone else. And then think critically about the ways that we have, how we list education on our job descriptions. Is it actually imperative that someone has a bachelor's degree, a master's degree? Is that actually imperative? Or is a lived experience something that you'll be willing to consider? Because I know in my line of work, a lived experience is very important, and it is just as important, and often more so, because we haven't always prioritized that, and we know that we haven't gotten a lot of things right. And I want to start to get things right. And so I think that's doing more of what we haven't done and less of what we have. And so I do want to make sure that we're prioritizing people with lived experiences, and that means that we need to pay people with an experience that we need. So that means that if someone has 2 PhDs, and so you pay them a lot of money for that, or if someone has a lived experience that no one else on your team has, then you pay them for that. And that's really important. And that goes for honorariums as well, but this is especially important during times like this, when we are talking about how we want to have more folks that are from underrepresented communities represented. And so now is the time that we're going to see that. And now is the time to really show our values. And so making sure that we're doing that. Sorry, I didn't mean to share all of that.
That's great. You're getting a lot of love in the chat. I'm going to throw it over to Nadine.
Well, yeah, co-sign all of that. And, I think one of the things that comes to mind in this moment is a study I've invoked a few times. It's about the browning and the aging of America, that we are increasingly a nation of older white people because of healthcare disparities. White people live longer, and younger brown people. The math of fertility and who's having babies is what it is. And a lot of the anxiety that is driving, the regressive politics that we're facing right now is is informed by that demographic reality. And so one, I think we have to name that. The next thing that I think is really important, not only is it that diverse teams create better outcomes and higher productivity, and having these policies in place for business means that you are drawing to you not just talent from the LGBTQ community, but from many people, especially younger people, who see it as an indicator of what kind of environment, what kind of quality of life they can expect if they join your team. But earlier when we were talking about what, I think it's a shock to most people that bisexual women make up the majority of the LGBTQ community. And we have to address, why is that such a surprising statistic? But I'll just use one example. We had this gathering of Black LGBT people in the community, some organization leaders, some business leaders, just a cross section. And the number one issue that arose was economic justice. Of all of the issues impacting these Black LGBTQ people, majority women, it was economic justice. And one of the things that came up was, here we are, they were in a very progressive part of Florida. They said, there's an LGBTQ economic program and there's a Black economic program, and they have great statistics and they completely miss our existence. We don't show up in either. And so when you redesign how you look at things, not simply to check a box, but to say, are we reaching everybody who ought to be reached, who is impacted? Then you create a different criteria for evaluating whether or not your program is successful. And I think for our community, even the conversation about having to show up for Black leadership, even the construction of it implies that we are a unique and distinct populations that need to show up for each other, as opposed to the recognition that we are part of all of these communities. And if we have prioritized addressing who is the most marginalized, who bears the brunt, we would already be there. It wouldn't be a function of showing up. We are already there. And the last thing I want to say, is about the faith component. And I have wanted for a long time for us to organize a family reunion. Particularly a Black family reunion that tells the full story of who we are, from the Harlem Renaissance to the leadership of civil rights movements, from the formation of Black Lives Matter, all of these spaces where, the Black LGBTQ family has been, erased, or the influence of our identities has been minimized, rather than understanding that when we stand at a certain perspective at that family picnic, that family reunion, we see things nobody else sees. So I do think that the time has come to have that family conversation about who keeps getting left out, and that those hashtags that include Black trans women, for example, ought to roll off of our tongues with the same fury that every other police murder and all of these things. We have to address this and tell the truth. And I think in a world where critical race theory is under attack, and a bill's just been introduced in Florida to stop schools from teaching anything that would address sexism or racism, that truth telling about our history has got to become much more a priority.
Great, thank you, Nadine. Reverend Coates, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Nadine, for that. Well, I wanted to say, since we have so many activists on this panel and so many who will watch this, and we had Congressman Torres here, I wanted to share with you all a policy proposal that we're supporting that's really designed to help us to provide equal employment opportunities to those in our society and in our economy who are ignored, including the LGBTQ community. And that policy proposal is a federal job guarantee. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley in February proposed a federal job guarantee resolution. In our campaign, we have been going around the country making advocates and the public aware of the truly transformative potential of a federal job guarantee, which is the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. The full name of the March on Washington was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It wasn't just a march for racial solidarity. It was a march seeking a legal right to a dignified job at a livable wage with benefits for every American who wants one. And the reason a federal job guarantee is so important is because right now, policymakers and their economic advisors define full employment, Brad, as 4 to 6% unemployment. I need people to get this. This was a compromise that was made in the 70s to define full employment as 4 to 6% unemployment. So when they say, we're at full employment, they are not capturing tens of millions of Americans who will not be able to find employment, even in a good economy. So what that means then is that even in a good economy, there will be many Black and brown and poor and LGBTQ plus individuals Americans who will not be able to get a job. And we need a true federal option for employment that does not give the issue of employment, concede the issue of employment strictly to the private sector. We need a federal job guarantee, which is a legal right to a dignified job at a livable wage with benefits for every American that wants one. We need congressmen like Congressman Torres. We need congressmen and women all across the country who are pushing for a federal job guarantee so that we can make sure we capture that percentage of the population who is missed in the current way in which we do monetary and fiscal policy.
Yeah, great, exactly. And I want to just point out, a lot of the people we surveyed are unemployed or underemployed. They're in low-wage jobs, and so yes, we need to have programs. We need to have policies and programs beyond the Equality Act. We're nearing end of our time, Maria. I want to, if you have any last thoughts for us, I want to give you a chance before we wrap up.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor to be on this panel. I think that this really highlights that although we have made great strides as a community, there's much work to be done specifically within sub-communities in the LGBT community. And as a trans person, I hope that folks understand the importance of trans people, of true investment in the lives of trans people across this nation and the world. So I hope that folks will take this data and create programs that will support trans people to succeed and be able to, thrive within our society.
Great, thank you, Maria. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. I just want to acknowledge that there were other questions. Many of them had to deal with the survey methodology and the availability of the survey instrument and the raw data. We will make the survey instrument available and the raw data. We've got a few more reports coming based on the data. And if you have any questions about the methodology, you can email me or the Williams Institute, and we'll address those. Directly. We're happy to receive the input and love sharing our data with others. I want to thank everyone here, Reverend Coates, Maria, Imani, Nadine, for a fantastic panel. In addition to Congressman Torres, who let us know that he had to leave. I want to thank Rachel, who's been on here, and Anthony, making sure everything that goes smoothly. And this data it's only as powerful as all of us make it. So we hope that you take the study and use it in your own research, in your own advocacy, in your own policy making, and help carry it forward. And thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.